Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm going to talk about Matt Bruenig's "How Many People Live Paycheck to Paycheck?" A thrillingly ambiguous debate. Now, Matt is a few years younger than me and much more famous than me and much more social democratic than me, so I'm not usually inclined to be super charitable. Although there's also a contingent of online leftists who hate him because he's Catholic, which also seems to be somewhat arbitrary. Um, So I just wanted to go into this. Uh, Matt is a kind of smart, wonky person. I've used him before to figure out some other things like differentials and wealth and what might cause them between racial demographic groups. He was quite useful for that and breaking that down. But I wanted to talk about this one because the paycheck to paycheck rhetoric was used by both Elizabeth Warren and uh, Bernie Sanders, and may be coming back up because of the affluence debate with Ezra Klein and the kind of slightly to the right of Elizabeth Warren coterie that's emerging out of the New York Times Vox, pragmatic liberalism. And I wanted to get Bruenig's discussion on this debate. Uh, I've always found this number to be deceptive because what do we mean by paycheck to paycheck? There's a wide range of things that can fall into this category, and Matt really goes to it. Also, a lot of the data sources are bad, and we'll get into that too. So let's go straight into this. You can find this on the People's Policy Project, where Matt is one of the founders, I believe. All right. Matt Bruenig begins. Bernie Sanders is a big fan of citing troubling economic statistics. I mean, it's a whole big movement of post-new leftists that do that. He's hardly the only one, but as the grand old dumb of that movement, he's not really a dumb, the grand old Mitch of that movement, he has a lot more uh, habit doing it than a lot of other people. One of the figures that feature in his rotation is the 6% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. This number consistently irritates certain wonks, so I've decided to do a deep dive into the controversy to see what I can make of it. I got into this personally, watching people debate this and going, man, a lot of people are making very dumb conclusions off of very bad sources. But anyway, both pro and con, actually. In short, I've found the phrase paycheck to paycheck is not consistently defined, and that efforts to debunk the claim rely on data that don't convincingly do so, meaning that they don't really use the paycheck to paycheck thing. Paycheck to paycheck surveys, Lending Club, 60%. Lending Club, by the way, is a report that came out between June 2021 and June 2023. Lending Club, by the way, is a kind of refinancing personal loan micro lending site. So they're a little bit questionable to use that. But anyway, the figure that Bernie cites appears to come from a paycheck to paycheck report, which is a series of monthly reports put out by the Lending Club between June 2021 and December 2023. The methods of this report are opaque. The Lending Club claims to have surveyed around 2,500 to 3,000 consumers for each report, but the reports do not make clear whether or not they are simply asking people if they live paycheck to paycheck or deducing this in some way using personal financial information. Nonetheless, Lending Club report found that 52% to 64% of consumers live paycheck to paycheck during the month surveyed. Lending Club defines someone living paycheck to paycheck if they have no money left after spending their earnings. Put differently, for Lending Club, someone is living paycheck to paycheck if they currently have a low savings rate. Thus, as they explain in their June 2021 report, one can have a good chunk of money in the bank as well as a good salary and still struggle to make ends meet. Bank rate, 34%. Another estimate comes from a YouGov survey commissioned by Bankrate. I do not find the precise question that was asked in that survey, but unlike the Lending Club report, The bank rate write-up of the survey makes it clear that they explicitly asked people whether or not they were living the paycheck to paycheck, and 34% of workers answered that they were. The bank rate defines paycheck to paycheck this way. The expression living paycheck to paycheck generally refers to having little or no money for savings left over from your paycheck after covering your regular expenses. You might be unable to pay your bills if you suddenly become unemployed or don't receive the next paycheck. The first sentence of this definition refers currently to having a low savings rate, but the elaboration in the second sentence refers to someone having a low rate of emergency savings to draw upon in case of a negative income shock. These are not the same thing, though I suppose it is literally true that the former might lead to the latter. So, as best as I can tell, bank rate, like Lending Club, is using a low savings rate definition for the term, though it is unclear whether the survey respondents were asking the question with the definition or just asked more generally whether or not they live paycheck to paycheck. And again, they don't ever make this stuff clear. Bank of America, 50% or 26%. That's a pretty big variance, by the way. Another estimate comes from Bank of America. In a survey meant to be representative of the U.S. population, the Bank of America asked how strongly people agree with the statement, I am living paycheck to paycheck. Just under 50% of people answered that they strongly or somewhat agreed. And part of the report, the author stated the phrase living paycheck for paycheck can refer to individuals or households regularly spending nearly all of their income, leaving little to nothing left for savings. This is the low savings rate definitions. In the same report, the Bank of America analyzed the bank account data for the sample of their customers in order to determine how many of them spent 95% or more of their household income on necessity spending, which they defined as childcare, external credit card payments, gasoline, general retail, groceries, housing, insurance, cable TV, broadband, public transportation, tax payments, vehicle costs, and payments. Using this method, they concluded that 26% of people live paycheck to paycheck, so defined. Bank of America does not present the 20% figure as debunking the 50% figure. Instead, they point out that the lower number reflects a focus on necessity spending, ostensibly meaning that they recognize that for the particular definition of paycheck to paycheck, living is very narrow. Another limitation of the 26% figure is that it comes from a sample of Bank of America customers which are not a representative of the overall population, or even amongst those customers, they only have access to the income and spending information that those customers run through their Bank of America accounts. For example, customers that are doing necessity spending on a city credit card that they carry a balance for will end up miscounted. None of these have even dealt with the debt cost to pay out part of all this and what they're getting the debt for. Nothing correlates that. It's a big problem when talking about all this. The necessity spending approach is seemingly intended to provide an extreme measurement aimed at establishing an absolute lower bound of possible estimates. Thus, the authors of the report conclude that, despite the extremity of their definition, which cuts the self-reported paycheck to paycheck figure in half, their findings are significant and do suggest a relatively large proportion of the households are living paycheck to paycheck. I actually found the Bank of America study, and I don't love Bank of America, famously, actually, to be relatively honest compared to the other two bank sponsored surveys. Conceptual issues. As we've already in the 3 points, we see one of the problems with this discourse. The phrase living paycheck to paycheck is ambiguous. The Bank of America report calls this out explicitly, stating that the phrase is somewhat nebulous and not always clearly defined. According to the 3 reports, we see at least 3 different ways of understanding the term. 1, low savings rate. 2, high necessity spending rate. And 3, low emergency savings level. Those 3 things are related to one another, but they're not the same. I completely agree. They aren't the same. There are other complications with defining the phrase. For example, someone who currently lives off labor income and does not have enough money to retire could reasonably describe themselves as living paycheck to paycheck. How else are they living? Certainly, they are not dividend to dividend. Should the phrase apply to retired people who, by definition, do not receive paychecks? Do students who live paycheck to paycheck, disabled people, stay-at-home parents, kids, given on any given month, around 50% of the population does not work? That's crazy to me. This includes 40% of all adults age 18 and above, as well as 25% of adults between the ages of 18 and 64. Do these people inherit the paycheck to paycheck status of their overall household or family unit, or should we analyze them in more individualized ways? And people play games on whether or not we count household individuals all the time. This is a major problem in people reporting statistics. because they do not report them in consistent ways. How many people are in a household? Who counts as a household? Are you looking at one bread income owner, 2 or 3, etc., etc., etc.? I point this out only to illustrate that when we move away from looking at how people self-describe and start looking directly at personal financial data to determine how many people live paycheck to paycheck, there are lots of possible ways to do it and the many complications to work through. And now we're going to go to the government data, which is always what I'm interested in. Not that I love the government data, but it's usually the best set of data that we have that's publicly available, because any other good data is probably hoarded by somebody. The most prominent critic of the idea that paycheck to paycheck living is very common is Matt Darling. His rebuttal typically consists of 2 figures from the Survey of Confused Finances, the SCF, and 1 survey from the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, SHED, which is where it belongs. Okay. Both are government surveys conducted or sponsored by the Federal Reserve. The Survey of Consumer Finances. The first SCF figure Darling cites as the median net worth, which in 2022 stood at $192,700. The problem is that this figure includes non-financial assets like one home and car, and relatively illiquid financial assets like balances in retirement and education accounts. If you have a 401k, you can access it. It still counts for this. If I have a 401k, I have a lot more assets than if you don't count it. I think I probably break even when you look at that or something. To address these problems, Darling provides a second SCF figure that more closely matches the financial resources people tend to think about as being available to them in cases of emergency, i.e. their liquid financial assets. In 2022, median liquid assets stood at about $7,850. What's interesting about the $7,850 figure is that Darling and Ben Krause present it as self-evidently debunking the paycheck-to-paycheck argument, but does it? The median income in the SCF data is $70,529. Wow, that's got a lot higher than it used to be, but also buys a lot less. This means that the median liquid savings is only 40 days of median income. If you were to run out of liquid savings in 40 days, do you not live paycheck to paycheck? How few days does it need to be? 30 days, 20 days, etc. You're not even a full month. I get paid monthly. That's, barely over 1 paycheck. If we drop the elderly from the sample based on the observation that they're almost all retired and therefore not receiving any paychecks, the result is that the median liquid savings falls to $607,000 and the median income increases to $77,825. Thus, for non-elderly who actually receive paychecks, liquid savings would last 31 days at the median. A month. Now I get paid monthly. So 2 paychecks. So 2 paychecks to paychecks. Is that what we're talking about here? All right. If we walk through the household and divide their liquid savings by their income to determine how many of days of income they would have liquid savings for, we can see that this looks like across the entire distribution, graph truncated at the 80th percentile to keep the scale manageable. The income in liquid savings by percentile. I'm going to try to describe this. On the upward axis, you have days of liquid savings from 0 to 170. And on the percentile, you have 0 to 80%. You go above 80%, the numbers get crazy because of income inequality. And this is also for 2022, so this is old data. We will see that there's a slight rise at the top 80 percentile, but most people are going to only go from 20 to 30 days. All right. Assuming liquid to savings income ratio is the right thing to look at, this is the best graph for assessing paycheck to paycheck status that there is. But where do you draw the line for living paycheck to paycheck? At the 60th percentile, which is a figure Bernie likes to use, households have 57 days of savings. For non-elderly households, it's 46 days of savings. The paycheck to paycheck claim doesn't just seem that outlandish by this measure. And this metric is using the SCF, which is a survey of household finances, not individual finances. And that's important because households vary in number of income owners. Income havers, not owners. They don't really own. You don't really totally. I mean, you own your income kind of, but not really. And which defines a household using a primary economic unit concept that effectively excludes any adult that is not economically dominant individual or couple in their household. So struggling young adults who live with their mom and dad are not independently surveyed and are instead lumped in with their parents. Adjusting further, that would knock a few more days off of all these figures. So would weighting the results by individuals rather than households, as the former would end up counting more minor children as among the population that lives paycheck to paycheck, while the latter really does not. Survey of household economics and decision making. The shed figure that Darling likes to cite asks respondents the following question: have you set aside emergency or rainy day funds that would cover your expenses for 3 months in case of sickness, job loss, economic downturn, or other emergencies? Around 54% of respondents answer yes, while 46% of respondents answer no. From this, Darling concludes that 54% of Americans are not living paycheck to paycheck. But Shed asks these people other similar questions, and the answers to those questions don't line up with the conclusion that 54% of Americans can actually handle 3 months of expenses. I know very few people who can. For instance, Shed asked the following: based on your current financial situation, what is the largest emergency expense you could handle right now with only your saving? The below graph contains a distribution of the answers to this question among the 54% who answers they have 3 months of emergency expenses saved up. The largest emergency expense that people say they have 3 months of emergency savings can afford: under $100, 2%; under $500, 5%; under $1,000 for $599, 7%; 1,000 to 1,099, 10%; 2,000 or more, 76%. So 24% of the people who say they live at 3 months of emergency savings say they cannot afford an emergency expense of $2,000 or more. But if we divide $2,000 by 3 months, we get $667 per month. In 2023, the poverty line for a single adult was $1,214 per month, and not all these people are single adults. Is it really the case that someone can afford 3 months of expenses if they don't have enough savings to cover 3 months worth of deep poverty living? I am skeptical, to say the least. If we find someone is living paycheck to paycheck, if they either say they do not have 3 months of emergency savings or they cannot afford a $2,000 emergency expense, then Shed tells us that 59% of American adults are living paycheck to paycheck, which is, of course, just 1 point shy of the Bernie favored 60% figure. If we exclude the retired from this calculation, since they don't receive paychecks, or assign the paycheck to paycheck status of adults to their minor children who are not counted in Shed, the number goes even higher than that. Of course, this is all using the low emergency savings definition of paycheck to paycheck living, which seems to be Darling's preferred approach. The Shed also asked people whether in the last month they spend more, less than, or about the same amount of their income, which aligns with the low savings rate of the definition of paycheck to paycheck living. 52% of respondents say they spent more or the same amount of their income. Conclusion: given the ambiguities of the phrase, I'm certainly not going to argue that there's an obvious real number out there for paycheck to paycheck living, nor am I going to vouch for the self-reported answers to that or similar questions in surveys. But at the same time, the idea that this is most definitely not 6% and that Bernie is being obviously crazy in saying that seems pretty silly, especially after you probe the SCF and Shed data that is meant to debunk the claim. As always, it's important to keep in mind what exactly we're implying when we talk about living paycheck to paycheck. I am all for people having personal savings, but that is also the case that in a well-designed economic system, big financial shocks are smoothed over, not by one's personal assets, but through the welfare state. I mean, they historically aren't, but, that's a normative claim that Bruenig's going to make. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but it's something you have to look at. Large expenditures due to health problems should be handled by public health insurance. Again, a normative claim that I agree with, but it's a normative claim nonetheless. Income declines resulting from job loss and disability should be covered by unemployment and disability benefits. Economic security should not be dependent on an uninterrupted flow of paychecks and good health, but is also not dependent on building up large amounts of liquid assets, which most people just don't have access to do. This is where I'm speaking. Then again, you see Bruenig's normative social democracy speaking, but there's a lot of truth to this. When we're hearing these stats and hearing them debunked, a lot of people are comparing apples to kumquats. Yes, they're both fruits, but they're hiding what the justification is. A lot of this is more the prestidigitation of words that we see all over our political life. If anything, I want you to take is you should be careful in trusting the numbers, because the terms used to generate the numbers is important. And dear God, don't trust a single survey. And on that note, protect your peace. Take care.